getting this over to you as soon as possible.
You haven't. And
Yeah. I don't know why it was before. Maybe it was the time where we'd finish and then we'd have to I'd have to head out and do something maybe. But
yeah.
anyways, it's right in front of me and it's ready to rock and roll.
All right, guys. Welcome back to the Fitness in Philosophy podcast. My name is Robby Gustin, and I'm joined by James FitzGerald. James, how are things going today?
Things are great. Thank you.
All right, guys. So today we're going to be talking about geography and fitness. It might have James and I were joking about a potential different title on iTunes. We'll see if we can do a clickbaity title. But yeah, I mean, you might wonder how do the two relate? How are they intertwined philosophically? So today we're going to talk about differences, obviously, in the practice of fitness in different cultures and societies, but more importantly, the philosophy tie-in is going to be like, what does that mean? Does that have any bearing on anything? The fact that there's, as we'll talk about, the fact that the German language is more guttural and literal, and the French language is more lofty and has vowels and letters that don't get pronounced. Does that have any bearing on anything? I don't know. But, it's a historical curiosity. It's interesting, but like, doesn't really bear much on anything.
It makes 3, 2, 1 go sound differently everywhere.
Exactly. But beyond that, I don't know that there's too much.
Should we really go, or should we like just seep into it, or do we like really want to go? Different languages and providing different responses.
It is really like I had to study German to a certain extent, like when I was studying Kant for my dissertation, and like it is interesting how like German is just like so like imagination is Einbildungskraft. Like it's like so literal, like building an image, whereas like in other languages, it's a different thing. So that there are interesting questions there about like, where does that come from? But ultimately it's like difference in language, difference in food. Does it matter? Yeah. Aside from speaking it and tasting the new food, not really philosophically, but this could bear on certain things about, what does it mean to engage in fitness? What can we learn about what's common among all these different geographical areas in terms of how they engage in fitness, and what's different, and what can we draw from that?
Yeah, I think one thing that we just kind of made some assumptions on is that language is going to be very closely attributed to geography. Not saying we're not going to have that come up through our conversation today, but I do want to maybe take it beyond language. If language wasn't the only thing that's necessarily unique amongst each of those areas, well, then what is unique to fitness outside of that area of language? But you also made me think that we probably do need to, pull language over to itself and fitness, global language and fitness, and maybe do our own research on some interesting stuff we could pull in here that has an impact on fitness. I know one I can think about right away, which we won't go off and not get outside of geography on, but is fitness education. So the competency of fitness coaching, it could be based upon how information is presented and how that is like spread amongst individuals, right? So, maybe the way that I say maximal aerobic power, the way that it's brought into Portuguese language, let's say, it could spin off for 20 years of meaning something completely differently. Do you know what I mean? So I think that language may be a separate conversation all by itself that I don't want to say is the biggest connector here for geography.
Oh yeah, totally agreed. And that, I mean, that's a good point. Is that, so I mean, that was just one example of like, I mean, geography, we can bear on food or language or religion, but language is one where it can, obviously there's Spanish in Spain, but there's Spanish in South America, and it transcends geography to a certain extent. Whereas, fitness, it's interesting. It can be more intimately tied to geography.
Yes.
It can spread, of course, but no, I think that's a great point. And yeah, I was, just as you were saying that, I was wondering, like, could maximum aerobic power, maximum aerobic I guess power, yeah, should, or potential, could it be translated as like despotism or tyranny, and just take on like that last little letter, take on a totally, I was like, what?
Whoa,
Wait, what?
that's not what we meant.
That's not
We
what I
all
meant.
want to be aerobic, right? They're like, no.
Wait, what? Yeah.
That's
But
what
that
you were
is,
saying the whole time.
yeah. We thought it was like a North Korea thing. So
OPEC North Korea, it's going to happen. We say it more often than not. I'm telling you, it's just going to show up. Yeah, no. Also, culture will drop in here also. And I think we've had indirectly or directly, Robbie, some culture and fitness conversations.
yeah, I mean, we haven't had like
Yeah,
an explicit episode about it, but we've definitely talked about,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It's been in the our language.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, like especially for the evolution episode. But I think that also brings up another really excellent point, which is that language, food, culture, religion, like all those things, sometimes there's kind of a discussion about this cultural divide as soon as agriculture gets started 10,000 years ago. Geography is kind of reductive, but science, biology, nature, like out there,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Irrespective of whether there's culture surrounding it or not. So it's kind of like that is, there's something interesting to that. It's something that the mountains are there and it's cold,
Yeah, yeah,
whether culture speaks about it or not.
yeah,
So that is an interesting connection there.
yeah. No, I thought about somewhat of a less intense topic, but imagine there was this massive, more clearly visible divide between healthcare in North Dakota and Manitoba in Canada. I mean, like there's 2 kilometers difference, right? 2,000-meter difference between these two areas. But let's just say you went over that quote unquote border, right? Even if it was a wall or whatever it was, a stream. Canada, US, Canada, US. I don't know why I find that humorous, as if like it's kind of like,
Were you
haha,
doing that at some point, like
haha.
jumping side to side and be like, I'm here, I'm there?
I'm there, I'm here,
I'm there.
I'm there. So but just imagine a massive divide in people's perceptions where you walk into town in Manitoba, say for example, everyone's like, oh yeah, like fitness is free and everyone knows this is what you can do. I'm just trying to think of the healthcare perspective. It's not necessarily the case, but less like that. And then in North Dakota, it's like, oh no, it's inside of these institutions, and these institutions hold the key to giving you the ideas to kind of prevent disease and all this other. And I mean, that's just two kilometers away, right?
Right.
But that's what we're talking about today, is like there is like science, i.e. material borders, right, that makes that differentiation. And that's what I find it fascinating. I look at this map. I have a huge map up in my office with all the flags at the bottom of the map. I am a fiend for just going on Google Maps and pinging an area in Italy, and getting at street level and looking around. I have, I mean, that has, if as a child, I would have loved if that was accessible, because I always loved maps. I loved topography maps. I always had a huge fascination with the size of the planet, the just how big things are, and found it so interesting, that people in Mongolia and how they live, and etc. I just always found that super interesting. So shows when I was a kid of people being in different parts of the world and doing different things. This is my interest and what brings me here today, especially for an area that I'm in. I'm in fitness. I'm in fitness education. I'm super interested in, i.e., what happens at the border between Russia and China, and what's the differences in fitness between each of those. And I think there's an interesting conversation in that.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think one of the connections I used to mention to my students between philosophy and travel that I think connects to what we're talking about today is philosophy helps open up a series of intellectual possibilities that you just previously didn't realize because you were so enmeshed in your own assumptions and worldviews and what have you from what you were born and what your parents taught you. And it's a very similar thing with travel, and I guess now with Google Maps and other modalities of just like, how do other people live, and they're kind of like we said, there, as we'll talk about today, there are certain things that are like, okay, that's interesting, but trivial, it's cool to know, but then there are other things that's like, whoa, like when I lived over in Berlin, for example, I was, they're far more environmentally conscious, and bike lanes everywhere, everyone bags their own groceries, and yet they all smoke. Just kind of like these all like, wait, what? It's just interesting, like very different ways of going about things. And again, some of which you're like, oh, we do it better over here, and other which you're like, oh no, they do it better over here. And just open your mind and make you start thinking about like, there are other ways to go about things, and different conceptual possibilities.
Yeah. And that's what brings us here today, is to discuss those differences. And if I may, can we start with defining, I think, what fitness means today? I'm gonna say that I'd love it if we move it in the angle of the interest that I have inside of it before we get to the point of like, why even look at this whatsoever, is
Sure.
that I want to classify the fitness concept as movement practices. Really, I want to really, because I think I have maybe, yeah, I may have some pauses on, or just still feel like I want to jump in because of the complexity if fitness is not really well defined, because because then I think we might get into this like, well, freedom of information, so there's, social media opportunities in China, we can't even then have the conversation, because it's like, well, maybe that's their practices in fitness because they don't have access to this particular options, let's say. So I'd rather maybe focus it on a material world of movement practices. I would love to,
Yeah, that's
and
fine.
I'd like to hear your opinion on what we may miss out if we do reduce it down to that as being the definition of fitness for today. Just to make sure we're going to cover it.
No, I think that makes total sense. I mean, in kind of doing some research on different fitness practices, why is Tai Chi, for example, why is that, far before there was any internet or any sort of, communist revolution or anything like that?
Yeah.
Why was that a method of fitness practiced in China versus, other places? And yeah, I'm totally fine to things in that realm.
Yeah, because then we get into, I think, fun stuff, which is inspiring, of trying to find that unique thing about humans that they do everywhere and try to extract the principles from all of that. And that's why I was thinking the movement practices as observed across borders and in different geography, I think is fascinating. To your point, I would say as a guest that, because I'm just speaking, so I'm cheating on this, so I know, in northern Finland, I mean, outdoor Tai Chi in the park is not done all the time. So now it does bring in, well, why there? Why is it different? I'm sure they know about this concept of Tai Chi, and all of its benefits. There are streams of culture that spin down, but there is something to say about latitude, temperature, the environment, and the actual land, and where people are. So yeah, I think that's inspiring for people to figure out, because then they can come up with, for example, I may hold a standard of walking long distances and lifting rocks, right? Maybe I'm in a desert, so that could be easy to do. Maybe in northern Finland, it's doing push-ups in your house and then doing cross-country skiing for hours a day. It's like, what you got to work with there? But the principles are still human movement and physical expression, but in different geographies.
Right. And then there's kind of this interesting A/B split test case where you could also ask, like, well, what if you have two places that have similar geographies and similar temperatures, and yet one does such and such practice and the other does completely different practice? Like, what, do we look for the commonalities? What's interesting about the differences? So yeah, that's an interesting one too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think we may be able to pull out a principle from that today, possibly, because we may see that observed in those similar areas and say, oh, this might be the reason why it's different, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the philosophy connection here. So
Yeah.
the first question you might have, in again, seeing the topic of this episode, geography and fitness, you might ask, like, why would we even bother asking about this? Is it just interesting historical trivia? Again, not, all of us in our travels and our readings and things like that. Yeah, there's some cultural differences that are just oh, they make these kind of bracelets there and they make those kind of bracelets there, and it's like, okay, that's interesting, but again, it doesn't have much bearing.
Mm-hmm.
Or, in our case, where I feel like there probably is something here with fitness, is there some deeper bearing on what our fitness practices should be? So super quick recap on descriptive versus normative. We've talked about this in previous episodes, but this is a central thing in philosophy. When we talk about descriptive claims in philosophy, all we're talking about is things that tell us facts about the world. So here's an example. On a daily basis, there are a number of instances of stealing across the globe. That's a fact that can be determined empirically. You can determine that from police reports and just looking out in the world. Normative claims are claims that tell us how the world should be. So if we say people should not steal from others, that's a very different type of claim than people steal all the time. People could still steal all the time. That could be perfectly true. And it could still also be entirely true that people should not steal from others. So with regard to fitness, we have this interesting descriptive normative thing with geography and fitness, where on the one hand, the descriptive questions are things like, what are the fitness practices of various cultures? And historians and sociologists, talk about, well, in Scotland, there's the Highland Games. In China, there's Tai Chi. And in Nordic countries, for some reason, there's more interest in, at least today, strongman and CrossFit and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
Africa has some of the best runners on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, we can ask questions like, are there commonalities, which I think we're going to go to today, are there commonalities among these practices that might give us insight into what it means to be a human being that engages in fitness? And are the differences in fitness, interesting historical curiosities, or do they reveal something deeper and more meaningful about a people and a culture? And then the normative questions would be, do the differences or commonalities among cultural fitness practices have any bearing on what we should do today? So when we are talking normative, now we're talking not just what are the differences, we're talking, is one better or worse?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something different that should be done? So maybe that's a good starting point. Do you want to, I assume people have a general sense of like different fitness practices, but do you want to delve in at all to the descriptive part and just kind of talk about different practices first before we delve into the normativity, or how do you want to proceed?
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I could really clearly do that, which would be dive into the descriptive of each of those areas.
I mean, I think the ones we mentioned are a pretty good, fair representation. I mean, obviously we know that, what was that movie, Cool Runnings, the Jamaican bobsled team?
Yeah.
There isn't a Jamaican bobsled team, or maybe there is now. I don't know. But actually, you know what? I take that back. I think there actually might be, because I remember thinking it's like a couple years ago at the Winter Olympics, like, oh, Jamaica has a bobsled team now. But I think people from watching the Olympics and other things have a general sense for like, oh yeah, the Russians tend to be good at like winter sports, and so there's some knowledge among that. So I guess that's the descriptive project. I guess from there we can ask, what do you think that reveals about human movement practices and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's simple enough. It may just be that whatever's local to you may be the thing that people are going to be participating in over time. When we start considering like I just think back to Northern Canada, so leisure activity in Northern Canada, for a host of people, by saying a frozen pond, you wouldn't believe how many activities we could actually do on a frozen pond. You know, it's not just skating around in circles. You know, we can do curling, we can do figure skating competitions, we can have ice hockey tournaments. You can do a lot of shit on a frozen pond if it's big enough and, you know, it's thick enough, etc. But you see, that's leisure activity relative to that particular location. You know, and then, you know, what is leisure activity to a local area here? You know, using the same idea in terms of geography, it's natural base support. You can't control, you know, you can't control the environment. Like you can't control it in Northern Labrador, let's say, where it's going to freeze the pond and now you have this accessible area for movement. You know, down here, you know, there's vast open spaces, right, where you can do cross-country running, mountain biking, etc., at the exact same time in sequence as that person could be doing that on an ice pond in Labrador. You know, so I think that, and I'm not sure if that's, you know, gonna, you know, allow us to use that as a base support to go around the globe and possibly cover just that. I think it just points out, you know, the main thing, the differences in movement expression, you know, across the globe. I find it interesting. You know, I think indirectly to answer your question that you didn't ask, but that was in the Loom link that I have down here as to, you know, why even look at this, you know, is I think it's extremely interesting. I think it opens people's, back to your point earlier of what I've been told as well as a kid, that you create heterodox opinion from traveling and reading. And the more and more you read, the more and more you travel, it just kind of just, you know, blows your mind open to possibilities. And if you blow your mind open to possibilities, now obviously you have a ridiculously positive base support to give people options, right? Why? Because they didn't experience that other opinion or that idea, but you have seen it. Therefore, you know it to be a possibility, and now you can speak to it. And how did that come to be? Because I traveled around and I read lots of books and I see the differences between all these areas. So I find it extremely interesting. I also think it's important because we can create, to your point earlier, comparisons, like I just did the desert versus Northern Labrador, comparisons, and also generalizations of movement practice, right? We can say what's happening in Mongolia at the same time as East Africa. That's interesting, but how, you know, and how is that beneficial in this practice? I think it's just like what is similar about those two, and you're not going to be able to get to some similarities in that, and hence the importance of this concept we're calling movement practice and daily movement practice and all the benefits we know it can yield. We can't get there if we can't do that comparison and then further down a generalization, as I mentioned, of like the person in northern Finland cross-country skiing is the same thing as someone in Ethiopia running at, you know, 10,000 meters, you know, on a high desert, super high desert, 10,000 possible. Anyways, it's really high, and just going for hours, you know. So there's some similarities in there if we can get it. I think also why look at this, because we sometimes forget that, and I could be saying the same thing, but the temperature, and I don't know if that ties into the interesting concepts of Montesquieu offerings, but right. Yeah, latitude and temperature does have a big part to play as to how people express themselves physically. You know, it does. I mean, look at my story. I mean, quick answer in an elevator pitch of someone who says, "Oh, you're from Canada. Why in the hell did you move to the desert?" It's pretty simple. I just say that big bright thing in the sky, and it allows. And then if they want to have more conversation, I tell them about, you know, the unbelievable opportunity me and my children and my family have for movement. You know, I just really do feel that based upon where we were and how our lives were, we were closing ourselves in on lowering possibilities for movement expression. But being down here, I mean, it feels like you can be so mobile consistently a lot, you know? So I think that has a part to play with it. Why I look at this, why I think it's important also is that we make claims, you know, with this t-shirt of being a global fitness company. When you make comments like that, and belief that I do have in that, you're going to have to get into those areas of knowing the differences in geography across the board as to how people are perceiving this thing that you're talking about, to your point that someone in Mongolia could perceive map as being something completely different than what I intended, and I want to make sure it goes in the right direction before we get to North Korea and they're like, CCP, no. It's like, whoa. It's a coaching education, coaching certificate program. That's what it stands for. I also think it's important because the perception of, this is interesting, and I only gave this language because it's something that we use. I wrote down third world intentions on exercise. So, we're at a point where, I would just take a glimpse of a moment in Western US, right? And, anyone just looking through social media of like what we believe to be our exercise practices today and movement practices as to why we do it. I mean, someone who, and I think of Daniel Lieberman's work in his book called Exercised, went to this tribe in Africa, I believe, and would ask them questions about like, well, what do you guys do for exercise? And they're like, what is exercise? Do you know what I mean? So, but there is a geographical component to that, and I think the intentions across the borders and around the globe, the intentions are different on this concept of movement practice. And I think it's a fascinating, fascinating thing. And lastly, why look at this? I'm just seconding what you said. We can come up with, I think then, what are better, or how would Bernie say it? Good, better, best, or better, worse practices of like what these, what people are going to be doing for movement practice. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I just had a couple of points here that I just wanted to ramble on as to why we should look at this and the bearing that it does have on what we do. I think it's extremely interesting.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And I think, again, going back to the original question, like there are certain things about looking at differences in geography, or again, culture is different, but culture is related, where we might just say, different strokes for different folks, but it doesn't mean much more than that. But I do think in the fitness realm, it does teach us quite a bit. And, going back to other conversations we've had about, why is it that in some cultures on earth, just like you were saying, what is exercise? Or, with Tai Chi, it's just embedded as part of the day. You know what I mean? It's just like people wake up, breakfast. They go to a park. Yeah, exactly. They go to a park and it's just like, that's just what you do versus it's a leisure time activity or something you have to do to punish yourself for that donut, or, something
or you think that it's going to make you healthier.
Right. A very, those differences in attitude by themselves, are interesting facts about different peoples and cultures and geographies, but they can bear on how we ourselves view our own fitness practices and what are the more ideal ways of going about things.
Yeah. I think that's the the comparison around it. We could take a stab at it as a starting, to tiptoe into there without being experts on it, right? Like, I don't know what someone's doing on Bondi Beach if it's daytime in Australia right now, if it's even called Bondi or Bonsai Beach. Anyways,
it's Bondi. Bondi,
yeah. Which is like an extremely, the word that I describe it is awe, because when I've been there twice, and I remember the first time with my colleague Scott at the time, who was the host for what we were doing there for education. I mean, it's complete awe. That's the only way to describe it. For me, stepping into that area, and we hiked around the whole thing and hiked around the side neighborhoods and went to some art exhibits along the couple of streets up and sat in this coffee place to try to stay awake because I was adjusting the time, and had this unbelievable breakfast. I remember looking out, and then this is all pulling into the movement practice experience and the differences in geography, is that, it's a well-accepted thing that, I saw a bunch of these little kids, which just in my mind, they were like 3 or 4 years old. And like, there was like a group of 12 all in a line, and they were all dressed up like little Baywatch individuals, just doing these little drills on the beach and going in and out of the water and stuff. And Scott said there's some name for them anyways. They're like, you know how the Australians have these unbelievably great, like one word names for everything, skimmies or jimmies or billies or whatever is like, whatever they had for that. And I was like, what the hell is going on? But the way that he discussed it was like, this is a well accepted movement practice, right? It's a well accepted movement practice. There's no flinching. It's like, oh, this was what you do as a 3 or 4 year old. You take this thing in your hand, you learn how to be a lifeguard, and you learn how to appreciate nature, right? Which is the water and its veracity, and the safety around it, and how to be in the water and out of the water and do stuff with the water, etc. Like, to the extent they were there for like a couple of hours. My whole point being is that, that we got to take into consideration a couple things. What is happening physically right now, and the age and etc. And why is that particular to that area, right? And then how does it tie in and be different than Perth or the Gold Coast, right? Or, let's say Huntington Beach right now as an example, right? Huntington Beach, which, just as a couple of weeks ago has now got rid of the oil spill issues there, but, it's not the same. And so do people still surf there? Yeah, they do in both locations, but there's something about the differences in geography, even in that I think are fascinating as to why people are doing what they're doing for those movement practices. And we can go on and giving examples of like the North Shore of Hawaii, or, Cape Town, South Africa. I'm just trying to give you all these like places of surfing. And I could tell you in North Shore of Hawaii, I would call it like where that particular kind of movement practice is going to be pushed to its physical extreme. And so therefore the people in that culture there are not coming as like just tourists to kind of figure out what surfing is. I mean, these individuals doing it are doing this movement practice with the intentions of like the deepest intentions of getting to understand this particular, we'll just call it for the word sport, but on a level that's much more, I would just use the word intentional there in Hawaii based upon that expression. So I could go surfing in the Bay of Fundy in Canada or maybe some other areas, but it's not the same, it's not the same. And so even that, I just went around the globe in a couple different places and it's still called movement practices, but the intentions are different. The intentions based upon it are extremely different. And I'm hoping just that could, make people understand that, there's a shit ton of spots as well that have no access to surf, and neither do they care, but there's still people doing those daily practices that are same across the board, but have different intentions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean,
we can talk about football as well, or futsal in South America versus a pickup game of soccer in UK or Harlow, where I spent a couple of months learning, versus what would be soccer here in Scottsdale. They all look like they're soccer, but they're not all movement practice. They're not all steeped with the same intentions that you might think they are. And therefore the differences in that geography, just proves our point of there's something more to it than just the borders that dictate that practice.
Yeah. And I mean, something I literally just thought of as you were saying that I think is kind of interesting is what if you have a movement practice that's forged in a particular geography and, kind of has that background, and then it moves somewhere else, but it's no longer that, that place anymore. And how does that affect it?
Yeah, well, I think that's what I was getting at. And I didn't want to take us on the folly route, but I think you start like, because it turns into Oculus, right? And you're in your living room like, oh yeah, I'm in Hawaii. It's like, well, no, you're not in Hawaii, but you think you are. So that's where the practice ends up going. It ends up getting into a virtual area. Now, when I was over here on the left side of that continuum, I was saying that Hawaii was the biggest extreme because it pushes the system so hard. But then I used examples which people may not appreciate, but let's just call it like a low tide beach in Florida. I don't know. And you got kids trying out surfing, it's still there, But to your point, which I wanted to glean from it, is that the intentions do change. And I'm not sure if there's anything in there on like your point, which I loved, your words you used on it, was like it's almost did you say built in, or it's like it's
Grounded.
grounded? Yeah, like gosh, so much good shit in that, with regards to, let's go similarities, snowshoeing in northern Finland. It's like probably a daily practice of like getting from one spot to the other, and we're like, oh, do you have your heart rate monitor on to see exactly what your output is? They're like, no, I'm just going to look at my traps or something. Traps meaning, there's a good meme right there. Oh, Brandon Gustin in that one. Traps in Finland are different than traps with Oculus in North America. No, your animal traps. You know what I'm saying? So they go out like, kilometers and kilometers in the cold, and they don't give a shit about that. To your point, it's ground, like that movement practice is grounded in, just the lifestyle because of the geography. Like a small aspect of it is because of the geography. And I find that wonderful. The running example we had given before, right? Running in Africa or walking long distance, carrying something in parts of Africa still. And then just reflecting back to North America and looking around with electric cars and porcelain toilets and, and the opportunity to have electric bikes.
We got to get sponsored
There it
by
is
an
again.
electric bike company.
There it is again.
James' favorite fitness device of all time. It's not a motorcycle. It's an electric bike. No, it's a motorcycle.
No, you're not pedaling.
No, but it's interesting. Like, so I grew up in Southern California, lived for a few years in Huntington Beach, probably one of my favorite places I've ever lived. Still routinely go back there when I'm visiting California. And
going there in 2 weeks, by the way.
Oh, are you really?
Mm-hmm.
Around Thanksgiving time?
Yep.
I will be there that week.
Oh, awesome. This is fantastic. This is mind-blowing, folks. We could have an episode together. How about that? Maybe. Oh, we didn't have one planned, but anyways, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but
yeah, well, okay. We'll chat, but yeah, I will be back for.
Yeah, I have a storied history in Huntington Beach, by the way, too. Maybe we got to discuss that sideline, but I came up with a lot of this project actually on the beach in Huntington Beach next to the pier.
Really?
Yeah.
I had no idea about that.
Yeah. Leanne's, my wife's brother lived down there. Him and his wife started there as engineers, and yeah, we used to go visit there because it was a place to stay. I did, all the, CrossFit certifications way back in the day. I used to stay at his place and then go to different spots. Yeah, anyways.
Interesting. I'm just curious around what time, years?
2005, 6, 7, 8.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, I mean, like you were saying, that's such a interesting and cool connection. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
But yeah, easily one of my favorite places ever. Grew up surfing, walking the pier, and then now here I am in northern Indiana, and a beach is like an hour away, and of course it's like, it's a red flag when the waves are at your knees, and but there's a thing called Third Coast Surf Shop, and I'm like, where the hell is anyone surfing around here? And apparently some days on Lake Michigan when it's like stormy, people will get out a surfboard and try it. But just going back to that conversation about like what is it grounded in, and maybe people now with TV and the internet, like seeing different things, and kids wanting to express themselves in different ways, and are they bound by like, well, I live in northern Indiana, so I have to be doing cross-country skiing, or I just think there are these interesting questions around if you want to be part of that movement culture, do you need to then relocate to the new geography to get the real sense of it, or do you just need to like visit and go to Mecca, so to speak, and experience it and then come back? Or But yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts there, but I mean, that applies to so many things, whether it's snowboarding or surfing, or I mean, you name it, these things that were born different places. I mean, I probably
Yeah.
one of the most famous ones that people are probably aware of to a certain extent, yoga was not Lululemon, and
Mhm.
Downward
Mhm.
Dog and Rodney
What?
Yee. I mean, not to knock Rodney Yee. I mean, interesting and nice dude, but like so many, breath practices and I mean, so much deep, rich tradition that has since turned into like this 9 a.m. class where you sign into Mind Body Online, and like that, and it was born out of this particular geography, and then it got spread. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts one way or the other on kind of how something born out of a geography can spread, and does that necessarily mean dilution, or do we just happen to see that in certain ones? Or yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts one way or the other there.
Geez, no, no, just that it exists. I mean, it was my point I made earlier of like people, really thinking they're doing yoga in their room on a mat with Lululemon on. You know what I'm saying? And there is some argument inside of that. Like, is it really yoga because you just think you're doing it? Because it doesn't go back to, I guess we'd say the grounded practice. But I one thing that I thought about as you were saying that to add to it is that this is the interesting thing that comes into what I called the maximal physical expression, or when those systems are really stressed. Like it's really hard to, I think, to use, and it's probably because I'm not knowledgeable enough in the surfing area, and I probably didn't do a good job of it giving different geographies of surfing. So, we could say I think the skateboarding scene is a really cool area to go in for that, right?
Yeah.
So the reason being is that you can't virtual virtual reality your way through skateboarding. I mean, it's a physical practice that I'm sure, you could say, because some skateboarding folks would say the longboard is my disdain that like I have for electric bikes, right? They're like, oh man, don't get me going, but
Yeah.
but they have some good argument, right? They do, and it comes down to, well, how do you want to express with this board and these wheels based upon its grounded like elements, and they truly do believe in the years and years and years of practice required to get those skills, right? And to be able to go through those repetitions and learn those things and develop this. So I think there's something in there, Robbie, that has to do with just actually how hard the physical practice is. To your question on like, well, how can we disseminate that down, or sorry, dilute it down into the possibilities of being everywhere. I think that
Right.
has some bearing on it, I think, or a tiny bit of a bearing on, can those things go, like can skateboarding, let's just say its birth was in a pool, or a empty pool in California somewhere, can that just go everywhere? Well, it couldn't at North Labrador in the winter. So no matter what you think it was, unless you got a huge house with a huge basement, you're indoors for 7 months. So you can't even get it built in an arena, let's say, or an open warehouse. So I think it's got to do with the intensity of that physical expression. To answer your question on more thoughts around the dilution of those things across borders around the world.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a super interesting example, I think, for a number of reasons, and that obviously they're kind of different eras of skateboarding. And like, I mean, I grew up in Southern California, I guess, right around the time
Okay.
of like
So you would know.
second wave
Yeah.
skateboarding. I
Yeah.
mean, there's the stuff in the 70s, but then kind of the um X Games and aggressive rollerblading, and BMX biking, and Dave
The
Mirra.
dancing in Venice Beach was the best. The guys doing the dancing in place with the roll. That was the best. Sorry to take you offline.
No, you're fine. But yeah, I mean that's one where I think skateboarding is such an interesting example because and you're right, it certainly can't be done everywhere. I feel like that one can get spread around more places without dilution, and partly because the geography is something man-made, right? Like
Yeah.
by its very nature, like we're
Yeah.
talking cities and rails and stairs and things like that, as
Yeah.
opposed to waves or mountains, but that is an interesting.
Yeah. I was talking about, I think, that the slight difference in expression. So it goes down to, my point would be, and it's not the case, but yeah, you can take skateboarding to Tanzania, but I think it'll be longboarding for 2 decades. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
they'll just be like going down the street on the skateboard that's like comes out of a pool in California.
right.
So that's what I meant in terms of like its truest expression has to do with the intensity of that. So, anyways,
Right.
but I get your point of it going across, all borders, and that does bring us to it doesn't mean that's the area we wanted it to go, but well, it is something I wanted to come out with today was an extraction of principles across the board, right? So, and I think it is, and I'm not mentioning this right now to kind of get to that being a summation point, but it's just movement expression. It's just done multiple different ways, but it's movement expression. And I think that's the tie that binds the whole thing. And then what that movement expression is, the intensity of it, the intentions, I think there's lots of conversation and big differences in geography based upon that. But we're all doing movement expression, if we were to tie it all together. We're not sitting still, so we are actually doing something with the body. I think that may bring us back to a binding thing for the
Yeah,
whole
like
thing,
a commonality.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. One interesting thing I was struck by in this, I mean, this absolutely, this is an area I want to learn more about eventually. And, if I am not getting this correct, please feel free to correct me, or if anyone out there is listening and I'm not saying it correctly, let us know. But it struck me in looking at, or just doing some basic research on different movement practices across the globe, how much of it, I guess, to put it in OPEX terms, was much more in the sustain realm rather than any sort of now, obviously, when I say gain, I don't necessarily mean like barbell on your back, and obviously the barbell is a relatively new invention, but
Yeah.
as opposed to
just resistance.
Just resistance. And there are certain cultures that, stones and things like that, but there are certain ones where that isn't. So I just initially, when I saw that, I was like, that's just kind of an interesting thing. It's more on the sustain side than the resistance side. And does that have any bearing on anything?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating insight that I would also wholeheartedly agree based upon my observations. I would only say, as I'm just thinking about that, some reasoning behind that. I think it may have to do with the intensity and the ability of people, no matter where they are in geography, to maybe experience a little bit of nature and experience nature about how people see that today. Like you and I know that people can go out in nature and experience lifting rocks. It's just that it just hasn't been in practice for so long. So it may not seem like it's something that's worthwhile doing. Whereas going for a hike, that, just goes down so many different versions of that, and I think it just may be that based upon those local areas and geography, people may just want to have this opportunity to be mobile and just move around in nature and experience that. And then it turns into all these, these different versions: cycling through it, kayaking through it, hiking through it, electric biking through it.
No, we're gonna have an electric bike snipers, and not with bullets. We're not gonna kill anyone. We're gonna have
their wheels.
EMPs.
Take out the wheels.
Well, you could do it with an EMP. That way you wouldn't have to distinguish between. So with a real bike, an electromagnetic pulse isn't going to do anything. Dude, so with an electric bike, it just knocks it right out there.
That's so good. I'll be clumped into the Cuban disease, crisis thing that's going on, a conspiracy of 5G and a whole bunch of other shit once I get down that road. So I'll know what I'm getting into. I don't know what just happened. We have a particular report, a number of electric bike vehicles in Scottsdale, Arizona. Everyone across the planet will be like, I don't know what's going on.
It'll be the Batman.
This big, this big, huge electromagnetic plate just focusing on people going up the hill in my backyard. They're just like, oh. Well,
you are justice.
You're gonna have to use your human power.
You are justice and vengeance for electric bikes. The Batman just.
Oh, that's so good.
Uh,
Thank you for that.
no, thank you. There was something I was going to mention on the resistance. Oh yeah, another thing on the resistance and side of things. One thing I remember being struck by when I lived over in Germany for a bit. Someone else was mentioning something similar to this. Like, why is it that in America today, at least at the moment, you know, strength and bigger muscles and barbell training and resistance training, whereas in like France, for example, I mean, this is stereotype and obviously it doesn't apply to everyone, but they were saying something like French men don't like to be over muscled. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Just interesting questions around like and again that's partly geography, partly culture, but just and why in the Nordic countries are that particular geography, or Scotland and things like that, why are strength sports more prevalent? Just kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, it does raise a lot of I call them super interesting areas without stereotyping. It's just like what has been observed, in practice, so and I don't know if it would, be that way, but as soon as you said the French, I remember following, and I should have had their names on hand, but there was a number of French bodybuilders back in that era in the 80s, I remember, and 90s, that were well versed at different kinds of, they'd show up at the world level, bodybuilding championships and et cetera. It doesn't mean, of course, that it's a point in time that's a reflection of what's in that arena. I would say it was definitely more grandiose in the let's call it the North American project, I guess, in the 70s, around the Body Beautiful and et cetera. You do raise an interesting question as to why that case may be, but it also does tell us why across the board, maybe in the US in geography, we have just a lot of different options, because it's a blend of a bunch of different individuals, right? With numerous different landscapes and numerous different, you know what I mean? Like fucking Colorado is not Florida, it's like, gosh. And so therefore, temperature and latitude and, politics and everything, it should make sense that you're going to have multiple different expressions, of, let's just call it in two extremes, really elite, endurance athletes in cycling and running in one area in Colorado, obviously. And you may have people, I don't know, who are great ocean swimmers. I'm just fucking, that's bad for Florida, but I'm just saying, like, what's necessarily right there, or flatland cycling or cycling across a swamp or something. I don't know. So that kind of makes sense when you take that into consideration. But I love that thing. I had discussed this with the epigenetic KPIs, or what I call global KPIs in mixed modal, that and if you go back and look at, you extract and rip apart all the finishing scores and times, et cetera. I just took one area, one group of individuals. Those were the female Icelandic athletes, and you looked at power output, performance, scoring, et cetera, across the board, and then you compare them like per capita amongst those scorings, right? You can't turn your back on that obvious thing. It's just like, okay. And so my whole point that I just proposed was, there's definitely an epigenetic thing to be said, which does include geography, culture, upbringing, the Annie, the Annie paradox, I guess you could call it. Like, it's just all things coming together at a certain time, which does go into your conversation, right? I mean, those particular individuals and their success and the capabilities, there's a number of things leading to that, but geography is one of those that we don't want to turn our back on. And it is completely different than, I don't know, let me look here. East Coast Brazil females per capita and their success and power output in the sport. Like, I mean, it's just like, oh, it's because, the sport is not there. It's like, okay, even if it does go there, if for 10 years, I don't think you'll see the same thing happening. So there's something to be said about that, and which is parallel to your point, right? Of the strong man, the Magnus for Magnuson. I still have a picture taken with him at a Swiss conference.
Cool.
I look so small. Oh man. That's a man. The guy was all man. He was big. But but you got to say, like, well, why? And I think you do have to tie in things like, if there's a number of them there, what's their deep lineage, right? The deep Nordic lineage. And then what were they living for? What was the reason behind it? How did they participate in recreational leisure activities for periods of time? I think you're gonna start landing on things that make sense for your commentary on why that's a big proponent there, and it's not, quote unquote, in France, right? As an example, across the board, right? It's not, you can't find some, as at my point previous, strong men, a lot of strong men in France, quote unquote, strong men in terms of competition. But again, you're going to land on that same thing that I found. It's just per capita based upon it. It's like, it's a big difference. So I don't know if there's anything more to chew on based upon that.
No, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I remember hearing a similar thing in reverse. And of course, this is a gross overgeneralization, and it's changed a lot in America. But, part of the reason for kind of the Nordic country effect and CrossFit and strongman and stuff like that, or particularly on the women's side of things, was just culturally, there wasn't like this fear of being like an over muscled woman. As in like America, I mean, that has started to change with like strong as the new skinny. And I mean, there are problems with that too, but you know what I'm saying? Like, there are these cultural differences where like,
no, for sure.
Oh, what's wrong with women having
it exists
or being strong, or you know what I mean? Like, and then other places where that's not, for whatever reason, that's not feminine. Or what have you. So just interesting those differences.
I think I think that's how it was expressed to the Icelandic women. Like, that's how they would speak about it. They just spoke about it differently, or viewed it and perceived it differently, I think, than other populations. But it is something to be said, I do believe, about asking that question, Robbie. Why do they think that it's perceived as like a virtue, which I believe a virtuous concept of challenging yourself physically, and not even being concerned about others' perceptions of what that looks like on the outcome? You know what I'm saying? I think the better question is, which I posited some ideas based upon just some indirect connections I had with the changes in government and the changes in culture in the 80s and 90s in Iceland. If you go back and look at it, and then you're thinking like, okay, well, this is the offspring from the people that made those massive changes in that period of time. I think then you'll start tiptoeing to like, well, this is perception, right? This is the perception based upon how you want to express yourself physically. And to make it very reductionist in language, they don't give a fuck. It's like, fucking go out there and be yourself, and no one gives a shit about, how you're going to be perceived. Whereas maybe in other societies, it was already embedded inside, is like, oh, be careful, someone's going to perceive you differently based upon your expression in that particular thing. And now you got this like this discomfort around going towards that maximal expression, because people are thinking they're going to be judged on how it looks for the outcomes of that.
Yeah, and that's super interesting. And I put in the outline, like you mentioned earlier, I went to the SCP and the Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy and was typing in geography just to see if there was anything. And I think what you just brought up goes to this potentially interesting question. I don't know how much research there's been on this, but this question of like, how does geography affect personality and temperament? And then how does that affect, fitness? Like, would you still be the James you are currently if you grew up in Scottsdale versus Labrador?
Yeah.
And do places that are more winter based, where they're not in a bikini all the time, do they care as much about appearance, and are they more like, I don't really give a, I feel like that's an interesting question. I don't quite know the answer. I feel like if you asked me intuitively, I feel like there probably is something to that. I think there is probably a difference of people who grow up in, deep, bitter cold, and have to like live through that versus someone who grew up on a beach or something like that.
I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
I come back to the idea of you can't stay still in a colder climate. You got to keep moving.
Yeah.
Whereas, and I just thought of two interesting points of like, bringing myself back to, and I'll use myself as an example so we don't get into the discomfort of different geographies and then attaching it to culturals and then stereotyping based upon those people and how they express themselves. Was, after school doing soccer practice, right? In Labrador in late September, right? So without anyone knowing what that means, it's fucking gross, wet, cold, and it's just shitty. It's the shittiest of shitty. But hey, we got 2 hours to do this thing, right? And so I'm just seeing ourselves like just nonstop action. Even like to listen to the coach, we would listen to them as they're doing drills to get ready for the next drill. Like you're just always moving and shaking and like, doing shit. And being still was the death. Was like, being on the sidelines, people hated it. You got to get subbed off. We used to go in people's cars that used to stay running to keep us warm. So it's just something to think about for how that's expressed. Now, come down to circa 2011 in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I'm partaking in this personal goal to be really good at 800 meters, right? And I start seeing myself taking on, I'll just call it for what it is, it's the ethos, if it's called that, inside of local group called Altus, and all of their elite track athletes that specifically would come from the Jamaican area, just those particular areas, and seeing myself like doing some shit and just fucking hanging out, walking around on the track, just fucking sitting still, contemplating, and then building up energy, and then doing it again. And then just like, sitting still, moving around, listening to some tunes. Do you see what I'm saying? That's the same thing in physical expression, but I think it's geography that largely builds that. It does. So I think I would agree with you that there is something to that, of that movement. And I also took it to more of a, let's call it a pre-modern concept of physical expression of, in especially the groups that I've studied for, as we mentioned with civilization growth, those in the equatorial climates, they weren't acting like those who had snowshoes on in northern Labrador. Do you know what I mean? It's not the same daily practice, right? You were on the move nonstop, moving around in northern Labrador, whereas you were in shade, and doing the least amount of work possible as to not overheat in the equatorial locations.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So I think there's something to that, right? In terms of the activity and the daily leisure and physical expression based upon it.
No, yeah, I would agree with that. And I think those are good examples. And I remember John Welborn at a seminar once. He was talking about how like noticing, and part of this is cultural, but I do think part of it is geographical, like the work ethic of people from the Midwest versus maybe Southern California or something like that. Now, I grew up in, I was born on the East Coast. Yeah, I guess because I've moved. Yeah, I was born on the East Coast, moved to Dallas, and then grew up for a bit in Southern California. But I mean, you get to see these differences among places, and yeah, just this notion of like, yeah, if you have to survive shitty winters or something like that versus, Southern California is awesome in a lot of ways, but it's also like people become weather wimps and, can't deal with anything below 60 degrees. And it's just, it's interesting how those differences carve the culture in certain ways, but also, fitness practices and temperament and character and things like that.
Yeah, my gosh, I could agree with that. I keep saying that myself. I've become less resilient, as I can't even make the claim that I have those Canadian strengths in me anymore, because gets the different variations in temperature here, and I, immediately inside are like, ooh, that's a little chilly. And I keep saying to myself, come on, man, you had 20 years of that. You had 20 years of that. It was far more extreme and you did okay. How really bad is it? You know, as I jump in my nice pool in my backyard that I'm complaining is 66 degrees now, right? I was like, ooh, that's chilly. I told my girls supper time. Yes. I was like, well, if you want to get a good shake up, it'd be now to jump into the pool, you know? And I'm thinking that's a problem. People are like, what, 66? That'd be fantastic for swimming. I'm like, no, I'm like barely hanging on in 66 now in the pool.
Well, when it's what the most over 100-degree days like in the nation, then
Yeah.
that probably skews you.
Yeah, for sure. Right. But I mean, it just goes to show that it's Arizona, which is to my point is geography. Like it does have an impact based upon people's physical expression. I just thought about that this weekend too. No, not this weekend. It was yesterday because I thought I was off yesterday, so I felt that was weekend. But I went for a hike, six total miles or 3 miles in one particular direction. It just goes to show how freaking far back, how you can get lost. I don't know if you remember me mentioning that. You can get lost way back behind my house in the McDowell Mountains. It's just so much beautiful hiking back there. Anyways, I went back there. And I was thinking about that. I was like, geez, this is the first time this year, quote unquote, since, well, not first time this year, but it's first time in 6 months that I could actually do that. Meaning I could have done it, let's say a month ago, but I would have been like taking numerous stops throughout to find shade. I would have had to pack in a bunch of water bottles and possibly some electrolyte. Do you know what I'm saying? So and it's based upon geography. It's just too hot to do that actual practice. So I was thinking about like, well, what have I done in the interim? You know what I've done? I was on the ski erg indoors. You know why? Because it's a nice, comfortable,
Right.
nice, comfortable temperature. And anyhow, it just makes people recognize how maybe we could all grow our minds to appreciate the variances that people have available to them for movement expression and daily movement practices, and just take that into consideration, I think, for geography. Because we could discuss, my friend Adam Castillo, who was an owner of an OPEX gym in Riverdale, excerpt of New York City. I mean, it's a concrete jungle there. I mean, it's like what is the environment? What is the environment conducive to being in nature and going for a walk, et cetera? You've heard my point made on Wednesday based upon that, right? People using that as an excuse to not get out and be mobile. So yeah, we got to take that into consideration.
When I was in college, I would walk from 120th Street in New York all the way down to Battery Park, which is probably like 6-7 miles through
Nice.
Central Park.
Nice.
But that was in
beautiful.
That was in Timberlands and probably did not do wonderful things for my gait and my arches and whatnot.
But you were doing some of those things I talked about.
Yeah.
Of just, you're like, why are you walking? Just because I can, I'm capable of doing it and I got to go to that location. See, it's like, oh, you get your heart rate tied to it. You know what your, total energy expenditure is like? Not really, not at all. But I know that I'm expressing myself physically to do that particular thing,
Yeah, it's something you're just kind of driven to or primarily kind of in you. So I guess one other thing I was going to mention is, I was trying to think through different, I think fitness maybe occupies a middle place here in these geographical differences that we might look at. So, you might say things like food, language, and art are kind of, yeah, it's interesting, but ultimately not very meaningful, these differences in geography. And then there are things like religion, morality, and politics where, yeah, I mean, specifically for like, let's take religion, for example, that in philosophy, that is a huge issue. Like you can't just get around the fact, oh, well, if there's supposedly one ultimate truth, like, and these things, different religions are saying fundamentally different things, like that's a problem. That does bear on the truth of that. I think based on what we've been discussing today, fitness kind of occupies a middle ground, maybe in those geographical differences where it's certainly not trivial. It's certainly not unimportant. It certainly has things that we can glean from it, but I don't know that it rises to the level, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know that either of us would say that it rises quite to the level of where we could say, well, Tai Chi is better than cross country skiing or something to that effect. We don't quite get that normativity out of it, that strong normativity, but interesting differences nonetheless.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It doesn't, I don't think it does do that or cause that conundrum like you supplanted with the religion conundrum. I don't think it gets there. I'm just trying to take a second to think about how it might get there, but not in how I'm holding it.
No. I mean, maybe what it does is the reverse. I mean, it's not, with religion, the issue is that the differences have very severe consequences for truth.
Yeah.
Maybe what we've been discussing is the similarities have consequences for the truth of fitness.
Yes, no doubt. I love how you turn that.
It's it's the movement expression and finding a way to, locomote through nature and
like a push-up in Singapore is a push-up in Scottsdale.
Right.
That's it. And that's the tie. That's the bind right there, right? It's just movement expression and what that is. And could we see some of the similarities across the board in terms of that movement expression? But I think, we did bring up some interesting things that I, of course, I'm biased on. Just keep thinking about the intentions and the inside of that expression, right? What are the intentions inside of that expression? And just appreciate the variances and intentions inside of that expression across geographies. I think that's the point I want to reason why I brought it up, and the reason why I thought we should chat on it. I just find it extremely interesting, and I think it's mind opening for a lot of coaches, really, because I think we just get stuck in this lane that it's going to be like Coach RX, and we all got pulleys and we all have dumbbells, and we're going to have mixed modal aerobic work on the next day. And we just have to remember that is just one particular way of expressing the exact same thing done with push-ups and walking around the F1 circuit in Singapore. It's the same fucking thing, Yeah.
But you mean not everyone has access to dumbbells and lat pull downs and the treadmill? No?
Possibly, yeah. And of course, then, how do we look across the whole map, and say, well, how could we start the process of making people, which is my whole big project, right? Trying to get people to recognize what are the principles amongst all that movement expression, and where you are geographically, and hopefully not allow, the things that not allow that to happen, whether it's culture or politics, religion or something, to get in the way of that, because we're believing that it's that expression of what we're calling, patterns one day and pacing the next, as an example, should be positive to everyone.
Yeah, no, agreed. I was thinking after your talk on Wednesday that maybe as like a April Fool's joke in Coach RX, you should have it where anything that someone has programmed, anything that any coach has programmed in Coach RX as sustain immediately gets changed to walking. And then anything that's gained gets to push up or rocks. And then on April 2nd, you're like, no, that wasn't a joke. That's just going forward. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, push up and rocks.
Yeah.
Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, walking.
Yeah. I actually found a lot of really cool rocks yesterday. When you say something and immediately going in, I mean, I have my own little mantras that I do prior to hiking, but and I learned that if anyone's interested, you can, talk to me offline about it, in digging into some eco psychology texts and eco psychology reading. Anyways, when you open your eyes to it, especially in my neck of the woods, just because you mentioned rocks and lifting rocks, I mean, there really is an unbelievable opportunity to express yourself physically in the resistance element in the outdoors. And I just, now that I, really, really looking at it with a fine eye, I'm just saying, I just had numerous opportunities yesterday with that period of time to just do what would be considered some form of resistance. Anyways, just want to add that point.
Interesting. Yeah, it'd be interesting to know, like, kind of like we were saying earlier about, and again, this could just be my ignorance on the topic, but just what we were talking about how globally it seems like a lot of the practices you see and read about are more in the kind of sustain or pacing variety, and just I don't know if anyone's ever done a history on like resistance practices of different cultures and what they used, and
Yep. Yet there's a book called Lift, which damn, how embarrassing, because he's such a great person. I met him in person through CrossFit NYC, I believe. Daniel. Anyways, it's called Lift. It's a great book. And then I would get into if you can get any old Iron Mind books, or just Google Iron Mind and go down the rabbit hole of the quasi strongman style old resistance. You can see they go into that area. They do like cultural representations of what their thing was further back. This is where I got all the information of that historical context of the circus man and the soldier and the sporting athlete, and it was really those three at one point in time that were the only things, right? And that grew out calisthenics and a bunch of other stuff. Anyways, just to say that there's lots of stuff out there we can read to get back to the resistance aspect, and where it moved. I would say from something that was just done day to day for labor, it moved through into this like performative area, because humans were like, oh, holy shit, we can do these things. And then it moved into like a sport and then attention seeking concept, because we didn't actually require it in a day to day for a lot of things. I think automation and industry had a big part to play with that. We now have, I guess, as easy as it's for using Wendell Berry's commentary. I wish I had a quote from his book because it would seem so smart. But those bales of hay are just moved by machines now. That's there's the sanguine answer to that.
Right.
There's so much in one sentence, right?
No, that's super. Yeah, that's super interesting. But even those kind of going back to, again, I'm still fascinated by this and want to do more digging. But going back even further, like the bales of hay were evolutionary and helpful, and like even those like on a time scale of like farming.
Yeah.
What was resistance before that?
Yeah, before that, man, I could only glean the throwing of rocks, throwing of spears, combat to get resources from the environment. I'm just using like a hunter gatherer approach.
Right.
Building
Cut off
things,
you.
that would be it.
Yeah. Wrestling, like pushing someone away or pushing someone off you or getting up off the ground, or yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting.
And the practice of that, right? But I think in a hunter gatherer, probably only through civilization is where we had like the actual manufactured practice of 1,000 people doing military practices, right?
Right.
You go back and study, which I haven't done a deep dive enough, but I have this great book I just picked up, the mythologies around the birth of the ninja warrior. It gives a lot of really cool information as to how, where that came from from war times and just daily physical practices and the weird intertwining of that, right? Like it's like, oh, we could practice these things, but now you got to, take care of this guy, So I think that's probably a time through civilization where we got to this, let's call it roughhousing, which is the classical terminology of that, moved into like the practice of roughhousing,
Right.
And at the same time it would have been the Greek wrestling, times, which were fascinating itself. But yeah, prior to that, probably wasn't even, it was just building homes or building shelters or activities that were necessary in order to feed.
Yeah. I mean, dragging a kill, maybe.
Yep. Or the process of, being able to kill that thing, is
Yeah.
very adrenaline producing and, probably violent,
Yeah.
which requires some quote unquote resistance in some way, shape, or form.
Ground to shoulder. There we go, James. Don't say the games aren't functional.
You're going Paul Check on me now, because that's his exact pictures. He had like the spear in the picture, or the big thing, and then he had the animal up on his shoulder and he was lunging with it.
Oh,
and no one lunged with the carcass.
Yeah, no, that part
They actually packaged that up and called everyone over. Everyone take a small piece of this and bring it back,
snatch it overhead.
Yeah, the picture. This is the biggest one, worst one. The electric bike overhead squat.
Oh man.
On top of a mountain.
Do you know who Chris Duffin is?
No.
Like Kabuki Strength, any of that stuff?
I know that. I know Kabuki Strength.
Yeah, he's like the founder of that, or one of the founders of that. Anyway, he's got like a funny thing where like he hates 35-pound plates. They're useless. Like, keep the 25s and the 45s. We should have a thing like,
I like them already.
just death to electric bikes and like, yeah. Just shirts and hashtags that but it's like one of his, it's completely, well, it's not completely tangential, but it's tangential to what he does, but it's like one of his most popular, like people just get a kick out of it. So
good. I'll keep going on the bikes then. Yeah. Maybe we'll meet up sometime and berate to the same audience.
Yeah,
they're the same people. Yeah, they're the same people.
And people who like 35s, people who like electric bikes. So.
Yeah. Maybe I can be on his memes generated one time.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Similar groups.
Definitely. Well, I think we did a pretty good job of getting to everything we wanted to today. So I guess just to wrap it all up, we were, initially asking like, why even bother talking about this? And, talking about how historians and sociologists look at the facts of differences in cultures. And then we were asking more of the normative question, like, what can we gain from looking at these? Like, what sort of impact does this have on, how we practice fitness today? And I think the eventual answer we came around to is that this occupies some middle space where it isn't quite a historical or cultural or geographical triviality, but it doesn't quite rise to the level of like differences in religion, morality, or politics, and that it's not so much the differences that are quite so important, but the commonalities that ultimately bear on movement practice for today.
Yes. Beautiful summary on what I was hoping to get from it too.
The more you know. Do you remember those commercials?
Yeah. That should come across the screen. We really need to up our game. As you were saying that,
yeah,
it should be playing like down here in the corner.
Yeah. Like the G.I. Joe cartoons, and that's half the battle. Knowing it's half the battle.
They made it seem so real. So what are we talking about here again? It's toy, right?
Yeah. I enjoyed that. Yeah, I think that was a good conversation.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you so much, James. I'll see you next time.
See you.